In When I Think, one of Robert Creeley's poems, the poetic subject looks back on his life and realizes that everything and everybody in it has always been in the flux of time. The poem ends with these lines: "When I try to think of things, of what's happened, of what a life is and was my life, when I wonder what it meant, the sad days passing, the continuing echoing deaths, all the painful belligerent news, and the dogs still waiting to be fed, the closeness of you sleeping, voices, presences of children, of our own grown children, the shining bright sun, the smell of the air just now, each physical moment passing, passing, it's what it always is or ever was, just then, just there." Creeley's poem is one example of a poetic text dealing with time. The fact of the matter is, whatever literature we turn to, in whatever language, and irrespective of the genre or the period, time is often the theme or one of the main themes of the work we happen to be reading. Perhaps even more so in the literature of modernism, produced over a number of decades, in which scientific and technological modernity accelerated to such an extent that the perception of time became, if anything, more acute than ever. In the 1920s and 1930s, Majorcan psychiatrist Llorenç Villalonga published a number of articles in the press that showed his contempt for Catalan culture in general and the Catalan language in particular. He regarded culture as inward-looking and parochial, and the Catalan language as lacking in the tools any decent writer needed to engage with the contemporary world. Intriguingly, though, his first novel, Death of a Lady, was published in Catalan in 1931. His second, Madame de Lune, came out in 1937 as the Spanish War raged on. A year earlier, at the outbreak of the war, Villalonga had joined the Spanish Fascist Party, and after 1939 he would support Francoism without any compunction. In 1956, The Doll's Room, considered his masterpiece, appeared in Spanish. Between the late 1960s and the early to mid-1970s, he published in Catalan a number of extremely reactionary novels, culminating in the dystopia Andrea Victrix, which draws heavily on Huxley's Brave New World. Villalonga's relationship with Catalan culture and the Catalan language was always problematic, to say the least, and yet he eventually became one of the most canonical Catalan novelists of the 20th century. His status as a prominent member of the Catalan canon is a long story that falls outside the remit of this paper. My purpose is to look very briefly at the way in which four of his novels represent the decline and demise of the 19th century, and more generally Western civilization, with particular attention to his use of female aging and malady as literary symbols for a crumbling world. First of all, perhaps we should ask ourselves if Villalonga was a modernist writer. In the modernist novel, A Critical Introduction, Stephen Kern argues against expanding the modernist literary canon on any disciplinary, political or theoretical grounds. He makes the point that within the time frame of modernism, Americans and Europeans had a common pool of experiences, from urbanism to communism, from feminism to World War I, from Nazism to imperialism and subsequent decolonization, that were fundamentally different to those of non-Westerners. Essentially, he says, modernist novels are set primarily in Europe and America and concern people from those areas, and while they had unique styles, they shared concerns about the Western world. This is true, of course, but even a cursory glance at the huge mass of scholarship on modernism will indicate that some Europeans are more European than others. Catalan and Spanish texts, for example, are conspicuous for their absence from the modernist canon. This anomaly is exacerbated by the habit that Catalan as well as Spanish critics have to use the terms modernismo and modernismo respectively, in a sense that has little or nothing to do with modernism or indeed with each other. The fact that Catalan and Spanish literatures are one of the blind spots of Anglo-Saxon scholars on the one hand, and on the other the tendency of Catalan and Spanish critics to underline the Catalanness or Spanishness of local authors, have conspired to leave outside the canon of European modernism many works that should be part of it. Villalonga's are a case in point, and perhaps the easiest way to recontextualize them within modernism is to focus on how they use female aging and malady, the ravages of time and female bodies, as a strategy to represent the end of an era. Critics' contention that Villalonga does not fit into any of the categories or stereotypes of contemporary writers is misleading. In reality, he is nothing if not a contemporary writer, or to be precise, a modern writer, in the sense that Stephen Spender used this term nearly 60 years ago in The Struggle of the Modern. Spender made a by now well-known distinction between moderns and contemporaries. The first set out to create a new kind of literature in order to respond to the newness of the age, a literature that clashes with the conventions of tradition and renders them obsolete. As for the contemporaries, they are at least partly aware of the claim that there is a modern situation, but refuse to regard it as a problem special to art. That's Spender's words. The contemporaries find themselves at home in the world, which they see as susceptible to improvement. This optimism does not prevent them from being critical of society. On the contrary, they are likely to be revolutionaries, and they take sides in the conflicts thrown up by life. Unlike the contemporaries, the moderns distrust or even detest the idea of progress, as Spender, and view the results of science as a catastrophe to the values of past civilization. They feel cut off from the past and do not accept the forces and values of the present, although they are aware that there is no point in trying to live in the past by ignoring the present. The reaction to being cut off from the past is nostalgia, a nostalgia that goes hand in hand with hatred of the present. According to Spender, I quote, "Nostalgia and hatred are two sides of the same medal." Both nostalgia for the past and hatred of the present are so conspicuous in Villalonga's fictions that he might well have provided a prototype for the modern artist, or for the reactionary modernist, or for the 20th century version of Compagnon's Anti-Moderne. In a letter to his publisher that functions as an introduction to his fictionalized autobiography, Villalonga writes, "I feel nostalgia for the past, the non-existence of the present, and I am both skeptical about and intrigued by the future." In his work, this nostalgia for the past can be glimpsed already at the end of Death of a Lady, a novel that begins and ends with Obdulia Moncada's death in the late 1920s or early 1930s, a death always put off so that Obdulia's unspecified illness and dying process can be used as a thread that holds together the various chapters of the novel. In the first, the narrator lets it be known that he, or perhaps another intradiegetic narrator, is recalling the end of an era. Before everything falls apart, he says, they, that is to say the narrator, would like to chronicle some of the exemplary scenarios where his childhood developed. Now, Day's childhood belongs in the world of Obdulia Moncada, who symbolizes the 19th century. Early on in the novel, we read, "The lady was the soul of a society on the brink of disappearing." Obdulia Moncada's physical appearance and esprit are described in the following terms. Physically, she had been a 19th century lady, she had big breasts and wore colourful dresses. Now, in her old age, she was a caricature of a fragile doll. Time is unforgiving and had dissolved her charming chubbiness. To cut a long story short, Obdulia is a grotesque character on whom the narrator pours all the scorn he feels towards the 19th century, tempered by a small measure of sympathy. She's fat, thick as a plank, irrational, loud, blissfully oblivious of social conventions, and yet her symbolic death will prompt the narrator to reflect that the society that will replace the one she symbolizes may not be a better one after all. Madame Dillon, Villalonga's second novel, is set in Majorca circa 1935. While staying on the island, 50-year-old Alicia Dillon, the protagonist, has a relationship with the local aristocrat 25 years her junior. Alicia is characterized by the narrator as one of the most elegant ladies of Middle Europe, as an ancient lady and a millionaire, an exotic, childless, highly rational, war-weary woman of great sophistication. Alicia knew that the world is small, life is tedious, love does not exist. A lady who devotes the time she has on her hands when her young lover goes hunting to her toilette and her endless daydreaming. To the young labourers on the estate rented by Alicia, she's simply someone from another planet, a planet so remote as to preclude sexual attraction. They did not see her as an old woman, explains the narrator, but as a different one, and yet it is possible that their instinct, sharper than reason, had guessed what their intelligence could not. Did they grasp that her firm breasts had been operated on, and the blonde curls over her temples hid two scars caused by the surgical removal of a wrinkle? Alicia's exotic beauty, her rationality, and her imminent physical decrepitude, concealed under layers of makeup, turn her into a twilight character. These twilight qualities further underlined by the possibility of financial ruin and her war weariness. Indeed, she feels very old and wishes to fade away. In the farewell letter to her lover that constitutes the last chapter of the novel, she confides in him, "I am centuries old, I have lived too much, and it is time for me to go." Now, Alicia is centuries old because she allegorizes Western culture as it is conceived in Ortega's The Theme of Our Time, an essay that had been discussed by Villalonga in the local press. In his essay, Ortega announces to his readers the dawning of a new age that will replace Western culture as they know it, as a culture heavily reliant on reason since Socrates invented it centuries ago. Hence her weariness, her feeling terribly old, her awareness that it is time for her to ride into the sunset. The theme of our time, that is, the task Ortega attributes to the newly born era, consists in dethroning or downgrading reason, or to use the philosopher's own words, consists in subjecting reason to life, in placing reason within the biological sphere, in putting what is spontaneous before what is rational. Ortega is, of course, one of the best disciples of Nietzsche. The theme of our time is not the only intertext colouring the character of Alicia. 30 years before her stay on the island, she had a sexual experience with a family chauffeur in Paris. The experience in question was sordid enough for her to remember it as a kind of death. This apparently irrelevant episode acquires deeper meaning if we bear in mind that, one, it took place shortly after World War I, seen by Ortega and many others as one of the clearest signs that European culture had failed, and two, it involved the chauffeur of all people, a character best understood in the light of Count Kaiserling's theory that the chauffeur is the type of man that embodies the spirit of the masses. In The World in the Making, Count Kaiserling had stated the chauffeur is primitive man propped up by technology. The World in the Making came out in 1927. 3 years later, Ortega would publish The Revolt of the Masses, a seminal text of reactionary modernism, and one that goes a long way to justify John Kerry's suggestion that, and I quote, "the principle around which modernist literature and culture fashioned themselves was the exclusion of the masses, the defeat of their power, the removal of their literacy, the denial of their humanity." To deny the humanity of the masses is what Villalonga does in The Big Bang, a novel from 1968 whose protagonist, Lily, is an overweight Majorcan woman in her 40s who travels to Paris where she will become a celebrated avant-garde artist and a globally famous Oscar-winning cinema star for the simple reason that she has no talent whatsoever as a painter or as an actor. In the first chapter, the narrator sketches out Lily's biography up to the point where she's traveling to Paris, and there is nothing flattering in it. At the age of 12, she was still illiterate. In her late teens, she went through pregnancy without knowing she was pregnant. The father of the stillborn was the family chauffeur, incidentally, and she has spent the 25 years that separate her pregnancy from her journey to Paris living with her sister as a lazy, selfish, mentally retarded girl. In the novel, Villalonga denies the masses their humanity by referring to them as a beast that has abandoned its lair in order to corrupt an elitist culture, and by characterizing mass woman Lily as a small animal, a pretty dog, a cow, a childish woman with a craving for sweets, and as I have mentioned before, by flaunting her mental disability as a signifier for an era in which the masses have the upper hand. Before the Big Bang, Villalonga had already used a woman's aging process and her memory loss to represent historical decadence. Tony de Bearn, the main protagonist of The Doll's Room, is a character that lends himself to being interpreted as a personification of Ortega's theory of cyclical time, or as a personification of Nietzsche's aristocratic morals, or as a literary version of Spengler's Faustic man. Spengler claims that Faust is the most emblematic figure of Western culture, and his Faust has two main characteristics. First, the will to dominate the world, to unveil the secrets of nature, to usurp God's position. Second, the life of Faustic man is fully self-aware. It is a life that sees itself develop. Therefore, Faustic culture, Western culture, is a culture of memoirs. In keeping with his Faustic nature, Tony de Bearn is an amateur scientist as well as an inventor, and the author of an unpublished autobiography written over many years, which he finishes towards the end of his life. By a literary sleight of hand, when Villalonga wishes to fictionalize the decline of Western culture allegorized by Tony de Bearn, he does not rely on the hero's body or his mind. It is Tony de Bearn's wife, Maria Antonia, who becomes senile and loses her memory. Hence, it is she who allegorizes the decline of Western civilization as described by Spengler. Apropos of Tony de Bearn's surprising intellectual energy in his old age, which contrasts sharply with Marie Antonia's senility, Father Joan Mayol, the narrator of the novel, perversely writes, "I believe that at times I may be unfair, but my inability to define Tony de Bearn has always tormented me. I cannot even comfort myself by attributing some of his eccentricities to old age. His intelligence only increased as the years went by, and while his passions dwindled, he perfected his knowledge of people and things. His mistakes were thus even more difficult to forgive. I imagine that the peace he exuded in the last years of his life was more apparent than real. For Dona Maria Antonia, who died in the grace of God, it was quite the contrary. Her decline, more human than his intellectual vigor, was observed with irony and tenderness by her husband. For a priest, it was also a source of satisfaction." End of quote. To conclude, at the beginning of his book, Singing the Chaos, Madness and Wisdom in Modern Poetry, William Pratt recalls that in 1948, while Ezra Pound was incarcerated in the madhouse of St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., indicted for treason and judgmentally incompetent to stand trial, Wyndham Lewis wrote him a letter with this piece of advice: "You are in a chaos. Why not face the fact and sing the chaos, songbird that you are?" Like many reactionary modernists, Villalonga sang the chaos, and being a misogynist, he used the aging bodies and the weak or failing minds of his female characters as texts in which to inscribe his hatred of the present. Thank you.